Hello, I'm Michael Gaskins, and welcome to Where Do We Go From Here? The Future of African American Owned Media. African Americans make up 13% of the U.S. population with $1.2 trillion buying power, yet they only own 25 of the nearly 1,400 television stations and 180 of the more than 11,000 radio stations. Given these small numbers, 53 years later after the historic 1968 Civil Rights Act, it is understandable that many African Americans feel that they are not properly portrayed or heard by the media. Meanwhile, five mega conglomerates, Comcast, AT&T, ViacomCBS, NewsCorp, and Disney, own 90% of the U.S. media. This issue raises the question, why are there so few media entities owned by African Americans? This 12-part docuseries will begin to answer that question. We'll hear from history-making African-American media movers and shakers while examining and celebrating our past, present, and future place in media. My guest today is Allison Davis. Let's jump right in. You've accomplished a lot over your career. Talk a little bit about your career starting out in Boston and then moving to Pittsburgh. Down of your career.
Sure. I was hired to be a producer, writer-producer at WBZ Television in Boston a month after my 22nd birthday, which was interesting. I could write. And I think that, anybody who is a journalism student right now that I've ever dealt with, I've told them the importance of writing every day. And I wrote every day. And I was hired after taking a writing test at the station. I didn't have much television experience at the time. You have to remember this was 1975. And at the time, there weren't the internships that we have now. I didn't have an internship. I was actually a magazine print major and took one broadcast course and ultimately got the job at WBZ. I worked there in a early evening television show as a producer, working with a very seasoned producer. And then I ended up being very interested in investigative reporting. And at the time, WBZ was starting the I-Team, and I was chosen as the producer of the I-Team. We did some amazing work in the time that I was there, obviously a team effort. And I was asked to go to Pittsburgh at KDKA and be on the air and start the I-Team there. And it's exactly what I did. I worked with another wonderful, wonderful reporter, a very dear friend who passed away a few years ago, Charles Bosworth. And we did a story together, and he was the lead on the story. And it was when the lottery, unfortunately, when the Pennsylvania lottery was rigged for the triple sixes. And so at that point, we did the story about how it was rigged, and I got the attention of NBC News. I was hired to be on the air at NBC, and I asked them, no, I did not want to be on the air anymore. I was fine with being a producer. And I was a special segment producer for Nightly News, and then worked on two magazine shows, long form, and then the Today Show.
Back now at 56 past, I wasn't prepared to translate that as I was doing that little tease.
Oh, that's
that little mark with the A and then the ring around it.
At.
See, that's what I said. Mm-hmm. Katie said she thought it was about.
Yeah. Oh.
But I'd never heard it. I'd never heard it said. I'd always seen the mark, but never heard it said. And then it sounded stupid when I said it. Violence at NBC.
I heard around big fight up in the lunchroom the other week.
There it is. Violence at NBC, GE.com. I mean...
Well, Allison should know.
What is Internet anyway?
Internet is that
massive computer network.
The one that's becoming really big now.
What do you mean? That's big. How does one? What do you write to it like mail?
No, a lot of people use it and communicate. I guess they can communicate with NBC writers and producers. Allison, can you explain what internet is?
No, she can't say anything in 10 seconds or less.
Oh, Allison will be in the studio shortly.
See, that's what I said. What do you mean there's nothing under the hood? Katie said she thought this was a car.
Yeah.
And it's built using wind? Like from a windmill?
Or a fan, or a turbine, or a fan vine.
Wow. I mean, what is i3 anyway?
Allison, can you explain what i3 is?
The all-electric BMW i3, built in a wind-powered factory with the strength of carbon fiber and BMW performance.
Come on, loosen up, Gumbel.
Can you twerk?
Maybe.
And then after that, I had the opportunity to experiment in this whole new digital world, and I got involved in getting NBC into the digital world, and ran a sort of, it wasn't a full-fledged operation, but it was a test run in digital, and I ran that with 6 or 7 other people. I was asked to look at a new company called Microsoft to see whether or not they were worth partnering with. And so I spent some time going back and forth to Redmond, Washington, and you know, I wasn't terribly fond of their culture, but I thought that they were the best to partner with, and it became MSNBC. And then from MSNBC, I did the MSNBC.com for a while, and then decided, you know, it was time to kind of head up and do something a little different. And I was hired at CBS, going to CBS with Brian Gumbel, who I had worked with for many years on the Today Show and traveled the world with. And so when he gave me an opportunity to do some really fun and creative things, I went to CBS. And then, you know, after 30 something odd years, I decided, you know, I had 2 kids, and it was time for me to take the weight of raising these children off my husband's shoulders. And I came home and worked a nonprofit, and just left my last nonprofit job October 1st. Just decided that, you know, it's time for me to do some other things. I have a documentary in my heart and mind, and you know, doing some research now, working, you know, in the digital realm, and that's about it.
That's what a phenomenal resume. I worked at WCAU, the NBC affiliate in Philadelphia, sure. But I started there in 93. So I was with Herb Denenberg. I started there as an intern, and then I ended up working on the overnight desk in 94, and then we switched over to NBC in 95, and so forth. And a pretty funny story here, Ms. Davis. So I guess it was 96. I had just graduated with my undergrad at Temple, and you know, it was time for me to kind of, I guess, spread my wings from what my news director told me. And he said, look, you need to go find your real job. And I thought, well, this is a real job. So there were, at the time, 3 opportunities available. The first was News Channel. The other one was WMC in Memphis, where one of our producers actually moved on to there and became the associate news director down there. And then the third one, no one thought it would work. It was a very bad idea. It was MSNBC. And I can remember just a few of the reporters there at WCAU, more specifically, the late Edie Huggins saying to me, you don't want to go there. You don't want to do that. That'll never work. And some of the other producers said, yeah, that won't work. But that was really a funny thing, because it was during the time, I think they were actually building the building in Fort Lee. So it was during that whole process. Yeah. So. Well,
actually, we were in Fort Lee initially, where CNBC was. And then we built out Secaucus, which was probably the most amazing thing that I've ever been a part of in terms of ground floor. And then after Secaucus, things, they decided to move back into 30 Rock. But we initially, we were very temporary in Fort Lee. As I said, where CNBC was, and now NBC is in Inglewood Cliffs, with a huge place. I'm actually getting most of my papers. There are two sets of papers that I'm trying to finally catalog and send to my alma mater, Boston University, because they're interested. One is the start of MSNBC, and of which I've got just about everything. And then the other one is the founding of, I was one of the founders of the National Association of Black Journalists. So the other one is NABJ. And I've got two huge binders of all that from 75 to 80. So I'm and a smattering after 80, but the early stuff I have, and I'm trying to digitize it, and I'm trying to get it out of my house and get to Boston University. Because I think that, number one, I think it's important, particularly for younger folks, to know that Black folks were involved in the founding of these two entities. And to be honest with you, especially with MSNBC, they would like to rewrite history. And it's not to say that, I'm certainly not bitter about it, but, I think of my own children and the fact that, I have a 28-year-old and a 34-year-old, and both believe that everything started when they were born, not understanding that there was a tremendous history. And it's the same thing with some of the folks at MSNBC. I laugh all the time because Jeff Zucker at CNN was my researcher. Phil Griffin, president of MSNBC, was, a colleague of mine. Both attended my baby showers. We've had, and they know what sort of the truth is. But truth of the matter is that, I don't think they're telling the story correctly, and I just want to make sure that I put this into a repository where scholars can take a look and see what the truth is.
That's great. And I was going to actually get to NABJ a little bit later. I was a
Sure.
member at one time. But talk a little bit more. What was that like to be a part of starting a network?
I will tell you that initially, as I said, I traveled back and forth every other Sunday, and I came back on Wednesdays, Redmond, Washington. And I did meet with Bill Gates. I think, frankly, early on, if I'm to really think about what transpired early on, it was not a meeting of two cultures. It was a very difficult time where you had a totally different culture in Microsoft than you had at NBC. And it was difficult we butt heads a lot. There was a tremendous amount of butting heads at the time. And everything from what we wore, because interestingly enough, in Redmond, Washington, the culture was a very casual khakis, t-shirt. And of course, that's not the way it was in New York. You was business, attire. And I never forget, my first encounter was they picked me up from the hotel that they had put me in, and I wore business attire. And the person who picked me up told me basically to go and change. That, that's not the way they dress there. Did I bring any jeans? Did I bring any sneakers? And I said, yeah. And I went and changed, because that was the day I actually was going to spend some time with Bill Gates. We we were trying as NBC, we were trying to get them to understand television, and they were trying to get us to understand, the digital realm. The difference was many of the people we were dealing with at Microsoft at the time were Microsoft millionaires. And I'm talking about admins. I'm talking about, remember, you have to remember, they all initially had Microsoft stock. And that, having Microsoft stock, made them Microsoft millionaires. And of course, we were pretty poor, even though we got paid relatively well in network, we're still poor. And I remember going out with an admin who had just been there in the early days and had all this stock, took me to the most fantastic restaurant I've ever been. And he had to have spent on like the three of us, $1,500. Yeah. And it was just a drop in the hat to him. So, there was all kinds of cultural differences before we even got to, who was going to do what and what was going to happen. I've always been shocked, in terms of the sustainability of the network, even though the network has changed since we started it. There was a whole different format, and there was much more integration with digital than there is now. But still, it is something that, I will always be immensely proud of being a part of in its beginning stages. And again, hope that folks along the way know that there were, several people of color. Burt Medley, who's from Philadelphia, from Temple, I think, and died a few years ago, who was, extraordinary. I mean, I want that legacy to be maintained, and that legacy to be told, and that story to be told.
Feel like I am experiencing a moment of redefinition.
You'll see all the NBC stars bringing credibility and experience to MSNBC.
And we're going to really be able to change newsmaking, to do something very unique.
We don't want to leave any part of our audience uncovered. We want to be able to reach them all. If you look at this partnership between NBC and Microsoft, there'll be something there for you. Nothing is as profound as this new relationship between over-the-air television and the hookup with a partner like Microsoft on the internet. We've now covered the world.
Let's talk about your time at CBS. So you said that you were able to be a little bit more creative there. Talk a little bit more about that.
Well, when I came to CBS with Brian Gumbel got his contract had a show, and at that time it was a magazine show, which later he ended up, as we all know, on their morning show program. And he got a production company, and he basically said to me, I'd love for you to come along with me. What would you like to do? And I said, I'd really like to get involved in the production company. And he was like, okay, fine. So he and another gentleman, we were partners as senior VPs in this production company. And basically what we did was we looked to buy and develop shows for various networks. So we did, for PBS, we did a 26-week show called The Reading Club. And that show, wasn't big. It was just an idea to try and find women who were, particularly Black women, who were in reading clubs, book clubs, and give them a new book coming out, and then have them talk about it with, and at this time it was Carol Martin was our first one, and Renee Poussaint was our second host. But we did 26 weeks, and it was pretty successful. It was a daytime show, just talking about books on PBS. We did a couple of docs at the time. One was The Science of Sport, which we did for the Discovery Channel. So we had the opportunity to do and to look at the possibility of shows, of developing shows, for not only CBS but for cable as well. I'm thinking off the top of my head, we must have done, probably a dozen or so shows. Selling shows is not terribly easy, but we managed to get some stuff on the air.
That's wow, wow, that's amazing. Um, let's pivot over to NABJ and talk about the beginnings.
Well, it depends upon who you talk to. If you talk to folks from the Philadelphia chapter, they give a whole other different birthing story than a lot of us do. The truth of the matter is that I know that there were a lot of media organizations and journalism organizations in various cities in the early 70s. Prior to NABJ. There was obviously the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists, but we in Boston had the Boston Media Workers, Kansas City, St. Louis. They all had their own media, Black media organizations. And I lived in Silver Spring, Maryland, grew up I grew up in Teaneck, New Jersey, and in Silver Spring. And my dad, we were living in the Jersey area, and my father in 1966 got tapped by Johnson to start the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission. And so we moved to Washington at that point. My dad had been working for the AFL-CIO and had been traveling back and forth every weekend. And so at that point, and we were just waiting for the schools to open up to desegregate. So, and the schools were very good in Teaneck, where I live now. And so my mom didn't really want to move. And my father was also very involved in the civil rights movement with King and as part of organized labor. And my mom knew that he was in Selma. My mom knew he was in various parts of the country, and she had 3 kids, and she wasn't a brave lady, so she wanted to be near her mom and dad. So she needed that support. So that's the other reason why we didn't move to DC until I was almost in high school. Bottom line is, I was living in Boston, but I came home to Silver Spring. And a friend of mine said that there was a Black elected officials conference in DC, and they were going to have a reception. And did I want to come to the reception? So I said, sure. So I headed down to the hotel and met my friends. And one friend both friends worked for U.S. News and World Report. And they said, oh, by the way, before we get to this reception, there's going to be a meeting over on the other side. And I said, well, go to the meeting. You guys go to the meeting and I'll wait out here. And they go, no, it's going to be Black journalists. And ask me if I knew Chuck Stone. And I said, no. And so the bottom line is I go to the meeting, and there are Black journalists obviously in the room. I was at WBZ in Boston. And I'm getting a little anxious because I know Robert's Rules of Order, and they were not following it. They were thinking that they were following it, but they were not. And so Chuck Stone knew Robert's Rules, and he was trying to get some order in the meeting. And I said, Mr. Chairman, point of order. And he looked at me and he said, who are you? And I said, my name is Allison Davis. I'm with WBZ in Boston. Point of order. And he said, your point? And I made my point. And he said, well, Miss Davis, congratulations. And I said, for what? And he said, you're the parliamentarian. I said, of what? And he said, what are we calling ourselves? And somebody said, National Association of Black Journalists. And the rest, as they say, is history.
That's great. That's great. Talk about the early years of that. So now you're formed, or at least you have some sort of order together. Talk about the early years.
Well, the early years of NABJ was, similar to what most organizations had to do. you have to have some structure. So somebody was assigned to putting together the Constitution. That would be me. So, so I had, so I worked on the Constitution as a parliamentarian. I also worked in Chuck Stone was amazing. He was a mad memo writer. And frankly, had it not been for Chuck, we could have unraveled, but Chuck kept everything together because he knew the importance of this gathering and he knew the importance of this organizing. And so Chuck, you know, I really just, you know, I was 22 years old. So I took orders from Chuck. You know, he guided all of us in terms of, you know, timelines and what we needed to pull together to make this come to fruition. And so, you know, we had our first, well, in 1978, it took us about 18 months to really start organizing and letting people know what was going on. Some people were told by their news directors that they had to make choices between this Black organization and their jobs. I was pretty lucky because Westinghouse Broadcasting, or Group W at the time, the head of Group W was Don McGannon. And Don McGannon was very close to Vernon Jordan because Don McGannon served as the president of the Urban League. Remember, the president was ceremonial. It was not a paid position. So, you know, he got it. Don McGannon got it and was very, very supportive of NABJ in its beginnings. In fact, you know, spent money on receptions, you know, in our very, very early days. But, you know, organizing ourselves wasn't quite as easy as one would think, because you have some type A personalities, you have people who, you know, thought themselves to be great chiefs, but weren't really willing to be Indians. So, you know, you had some egos, but for the most part, you know, you did have people who were committed to making sure that this was a success. Though I don't think anybody ever imagined that we would be in 2020 4,000 strong, and in 2020 approaching our 45th year. But again, you know, what had to be done is what you have to do in any organization. You've got to build a strong foundation. You've got to be able to figure out how to make sure that you are sustainable through money, and, you know, financial support. You've got to have a good staff, and staff came later. You know, we were always able to embrace, we had executive directors, but, you know, staff came a little later and office came a little later. And, you know, we morphed from an organization that was less so advocacy and much more for really providing support to those Black journalists who work in predominantly white newsrooms. And that's how we started. You know, the Black press wasn't really involved early on. I think Pluria Marshall was probably the exception to that rule, but the Black press was not involved because they had their own organization. We, on the other hand, were, for the most part, Black journalists working in white shops.
So carrying on that whole theme of building a good team, having infrastructure and so forth, let's take it to another scene, more or less going into Black-owned media.
Sure.
And, throughout your history and being a journalist and seeing the growth of being a part of the launch of a network, where have we come from and where are we headed as far as with Black-owned media?
I mean, I think, I want to say that we are heading in a direction where we're going to see an increase of Black-owned media, but I will tell you that I don't believe so. Um, I look at the digital realm right now, the digital world, and what we're seeing, and I see it with my own oldest son, who, is doing what a lot of his contemporaries are doing, and that is they're trying to build something with the hopes that somebody with more money will buy it. And that's sort of the paradigm. That is the model for the digital world. That certainly happened with BET, as we know. You build something that is strong, that has viewership, that is able to be sustainable, and you wait until the Viacoms of the world buy it. Let's take a look at the Washington Post. I mean, the Washington Post initially bought, not bought, but yeah, they bought the Root because the Root was somebody else's idea that then was absorbed by the Washington Post, and now I think it's on its own again. The Griot was the same thing with NBC. I was asked to get involved with that because, again, it was a partnership. We, unfortunately, as Black folks, we either don't have the money, and I know that we don't have the money, or we are just establishing something with the hopes that somebody with the money will buy it, and that tends to be, white, folks. But I think about Essence magazine, that went from Black to the folks at Time, and then now Richelieu, and now we don't know what's going to happen because of Richelieu's issues, which have nothing to do with money apparently, but has something to do with character. So I just think that I'm not as optimistic. I do think that these gentlemen who have just purchased, that are conservative folks who have just purchased a network, a cable network. We can't even call it cable anymore, but a network. I don't think that, I'm not seeing that they're going to be, or they are successful. I think, frankly, they were hoping for, from what I understand from their job postings in journalism, they were hoping for, a more conservative bent. That's not necessarily where folks are now. So I don't know how successful they would be. Magic Johnson. I mean, I take a look at what's out there now. You either can't get the subs in order to be embraced by, the Comcasts of the world. I did have some hope for Quibi, which I thought, could be a great model for a Black network online. But it doesn't look like that's sustainable, that's making any money. I've worked with some young people from Goldman Sachs that were trying to do a similar thing as Quibi, and they couldn't get it off the ground either. So, and most people are starting with news, and hopefully, can build something from that. I mean, even the networks, I'm curious to see how successful Peacock will be, that NBC just launched, with, not great content. The only content that they throw in there every once in a while is news content, and of course they did it during the elections. I mean, I'm not quite, I'm saddened by it. I do know that one of our founders, William Dilday, who used to be at Jackson, Mississippi station, was probably the first Black general manager. He's now consulting with the new network, the new Black network, but I'm not, he's only consulting and trying to figure out how to bring sponsorship in. I think that's what his main deal is. He was complaining about the fact that he thought of himself to be retired. And of course, that's not happening in his life. But, you know, he's one of the few that knows. I think about, you know, another great general manager at KNBC, Paula Madison. She had the Africa network with her two brothers, and she tried very hard to kind of, you know, pull that off, and it was bleeding money as well. So, you know, I don't know. And, you know, I don't know if we have the capital. I don't know if we have the patience. And I don't know if we are, frankly, pulling these networks, pulling a network together to help people or to make money. And I'm thinking it's really to make money. It's not to inform, educate, or entertain.
You have now so many people that are creating these streaming channels, or they're going into YouTube or a Twitch to try to get viewers. And like you said, try to put something together where they can get somebody to see it and to put money into it. Are people being lost in that whole, I guess, process within all of that noise? How can you bubble up to the top if content is king, and you're pretty great at developing content? How are you able to climb up that ladder and to be able to grab those eyeballs if you're not able to get the money to create the content to take it to the next level?
You know, I'm not quite sure, frankly. I mean, I think what you're saying is working off an older paradigm that we're not. I think it's so changed. I mean, when you take a look at YouTube millionaires, I mean, you know, it's not, they're not terribly informative. They may be entertainment. My older son's fiance is a Temple graduate, and she's a YouTube influencer, and she was making a good deal of money doing beauty. You know, how do you grab those eyeballs, you know, and how do you keep them? You know, it's not about just grabbing them, because, you know, you can do that if you become the flavor of the month, but you can't keep them because there are too many choices. There's too many, you know, there's too many places to go. So for example, there's a woman here in my area, Natalie McKenzie, and her husband, his name is Obi McKenzie. And you may, as you're looking at your NBA, you know, that if you look, you know, as you're studying NBA, you may learn about him. He was a big managing director at BlackRock. He's you know, just retired, and his backing his wife's daily show. She does a daily show where she does one interview. Now, I don't know what, I mean, I think because she asked us to help her with her sizzle reel, and I edit, you know, everything that I could not do in a unionized shop, I'm now doing. I'm shooting, I'm editing, I'm doing all that stuff. And so we were helping her out, but, you know, I asked her, what do you want to do with this? And she said, oh, I want to sell it to a network, or I want to start my own, you know. And I'm thinking, you know, that's not easy. It's not easy. And I'm also thinking about, you know, there's this guy, Leo Laporte, and Leo Laporte has something called the Twit Network, which is, you know, he does podcasts, and he does maybe 12 of them. And he used to be like, you know, everybody listened to him. If you wanted to know anything about Macs or computers or anything, he was the guy to go to. And now he's losing, you know, I mean, people are going elsewhere. And it's because, you know, Gen X has the attention span of a gnat and the loyalty of a gnat. We, you know, people in my generation were loyal to television shows. You know, they would watch them over and over and over again. And frankly, you know, I mean, how did I Love Lucy last so long? Well, it lasted so long because of loyalty. It's loyalty to, you know, to the brand. And these guys don't have loyalty to the brand. They're loyal, you know, for as long as it's cool And when it stops being cool, they move on. And there's enough to move on to. And I think that's where folks are, you have to constantly reinvent. Now, you can't just invent and hope that they come. Because when they get there, they may not stay. So you've got to constantly reinvent. And I don't know what the next thing is going to be. I really don't. We know it's not live anymore.
Wow. That's interesting. So I guess the model that you're thinking is probably better. Stay away from thinking of going the network route or even streaming, maybe pitch your tent with the content creation route. Is that
absolutely? I mean, and be prepared to turn on a dime. I think that's really important, that don't get stuck on one concept. I mean, you've got to be able to again turn on a dime. I look at, what's popular on YouTube. Now, I'm a YouTube fanatic. I mean, I won't lie, if I can't, because I don't find a lot of the shows all of that interesting. In fact, I just gave up my Netflix because I don't really necessarily find anything very interesting on there. So, so there, there are certain things that I subscribe to on YouTube, and I'll spend a few hours a day watching YouTube videos. Like, I never even knew about the Karens. The whole concept of Karens. It's the white blonde woman who's obnoxious and they call them the Karens. Well, everybody is doing the Karens now. They're taking live shots of obnoxious white women, screaming and being racist. And you know what? Or going into stores and not wearing masks. And it's frightening, but in the same respect, it's entertaining. As silly as that might sound. I'm also, I will cry every time when families are being reunited through DNA, and it's huge. It's huge. People giving their DNA stories, and you can see how somebody starts out with their own channel on YouTube, and they have 100 views on their first one, and then all of a sudden you see the progression and how it turns to, then they have 4,000 subscribers in just a few months, because people want the stories. They want these true stories. And then you watch how these stories translate on talk shows, that all of a sudden these same stories you see, oh my goodness, I saw that. And remember, I tell everybody that all of these networks, all of these local stations, they have digital desks, and all they do all day long is to look at what's on YouTube, what's trending, what's on Twitter, what's on LinkedIn, what's on TikTok. Well, TikTok is the new one now. Huge. They probably have more people on these digital desks than they do have on their overnight desks or their assignment desks. People just watching and saying, this is a story, this is a story.
Wow, this is great. And again, I really appreciate your time as we're wrapping up here. Is there anything else you want to add to this overall topic? Is there anything I should have asked you in regards to Black-owned media and where we're headed and so forth?
Well, I mean, I think, because I don't want to seem pessimistic. In fact, I think that us owning our own stuff, this is an opportunity for us that other generations have not had. Generations certainly before me. We don't have to. We really don't have to depend upon white media now to share our voices. And I think that there's something to be said for that, because there is a YouTube, there is a Twitter. I've seen, folks get 1 million views or have 1 million subscribers and who are making significant amount of money because they have control over their own stories. And I think there's something to be said for that, because when you have control over your own stories and your stories are successfully being received, then you're changing the dynamics of our business. And I love that. I think that's important. I think that, when you're able to show your stuff, if you will. I mean, I don't mean to be, I just think that, we're in a place now where we can be leaders. If we have the right combination of information, and if we deliver it in a way that is palatable to folks, we have tremendous power.